Hi, I'm Nathaniel, and today I would like to talk to you about hard and soft magic. The distinction between the two camps of hard and soft magic isn't exactly something new. It was coined by Brandon Sanderson, an author of no small fame. However, and my brain didn't make this connection of how long ago Sanderson introduced this distinction. It was before 2007, which was the date attached to the second draft of his essay, Sanderson's First Law of Magic. Yes, it's been that long. If it makes you feel any better, it's been 70 years since The Fellowship of the Ring was published in England. And if you think that's a long time, Robert E. Howard had writing published, like Conan the Barbarian, around 90 years ago. Anyway, even though Brandon Sanderson coined the terms hard and soft magic systems, the ideas behind distinction has been around for longer. Sanderson himself talks about how his system of magic, the more hard style of magic, was inspired by how Orson Scott Card talks about writing in a book he published in the 90s. In it, Card talks about how magic systems should have rules and consequences. It's been a while since I read Orson Scott Card's book on writing, but I think he came up with some pretty horrific costs that magicians, like, it ended up there were some magic systems where, like, you would horribly maim your loved ones or whatever. I don't have 100% to remember, but some of the consequences he had in mind were pretty horrific. Despite that bit, the Card's book on writing is really good. And I like Orson Scott Card's writing as a whole, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of Ender's Game. I probably should give it another try, though. Recently, on my way over to college, I read 2 of Orson Scott Card's Gate Thief trilogy, I think? I need to read the 3rd one. I knocked 2 of them out in a day, which I don't think I'd be able to do if I at least did it in some form like the author. So, with that history, what is hard and soft magic systems? In my mind, the biggest distinction between the two comes from Brandon Sanderson's First Law of Magic and the essay he writes about it. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, Brandon Sanderson has 3 each around a law he made up on how to make magic systems the way he likes to make magic systems. The second and third laws are not exactly important for the distinction between hard and soft magic, but they're interesting and pretty good things to read, especially if you want to make a really well-designed hard magic system. But neither of them mention the terms hard or soft magic systems, and so really I don't think should be considered the definitions on what a hard magic system is. That's something else I've seen happen, but I'll get around to that point later. What I want to talk to you now is what I think the essence of the difference between a hard and soft magic system, and that is defined in the words of Sanderson's First Law, which I'll read to you directly. Sanderson's First Law of Magics is, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. That is, I believe, what hard magic is in a nutshell. Hard magic is magic that follows Sanderson's First Law. Soft magic is magic that if you try to use it to solve the plot, it would break Sanderson's First Law. Most of the times, authors intuitively follow this law. Remember, according to this law, in the audience's minds, so if you try to use a vague power to solve the conflict, it would feel unfair and often would end up in something like a Deus Ex Machina. That doesn't mean soft magic is bad. Sanderson, in his essay, says soft magic is really good to invoke a sense of wonder in the reader, though I would say hard magic can also do that too. That's more of a taste thing, and some people really don't like hard magic and don't think it invokes a sense of wonder. And so soft magic does kind of do that better for most people. And soft magic also can be seen as more wild and chaotic, like a fey magic, that is unpredictable and unknown to the protagonists and readers. Sanderson says it's quite good for being used to hinder protagonists, whether it's a random magical storm that pops up randomly and it's just like, blah, now it's raining, blah, now it's like raining toads, and really isn't well defined, or if it's just an evil wizard who stops the band of brave knights from rescuing the princess. The audience really doesn't need to know, like, how he channels his magic, or if he gets magic from, like, eating toadstools or whatever. It's just evil wizard, he's magic. You don't need to think any more about that. Sanderson says, the really good writers of soft magic systems very, very rarely use their magic to solve problems in their books. Magic creates problems, then people solve those problems on their own without much magic. I would go a little bit further and say soft magic can solve problems, just not the problems directly relating to the main plot. In The Hobbit, Gandalf's magic and knowledge helps with a lot of things, like the trolls and getting them out of the goblin cave, and so on. But that really doesn't matter because the core plot points of The Hobbit is Bilbo Baggins growing up and learning to love adventures and stepping out of his comfort, and him helping the dwarves reclaim the Lonely Mountain. The respective climaxes do not depend on Gandalf throwing burning pine cones at a warg or using other wizardly lore or whatever. Gandalf isn't even there. And that's not even like following the hero's journey of like now the mentor's not there, but he's just not involved in those plot points. And so the main parts of the story, we don't feel necessarily cheated because he just doesn't accomplish those. And yes, I do think Gandalf, specifically in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, is soft magic. I'm pretty well read in the extended lore of Middle-earth, but there could be something else in some other works that makes him have a more harder magic system. But specifically in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, his powers are kind of vague. And the powers and sources, I know eventually he's like the equivalent of an angel and whatever. But in those books, we don't know how he gets his powers or how strong they are, though they are kind of fire related if you think about it. And the reason I'm specifically saying Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and not the rest of Tolkien's lore, is I don't want to say something that I don't know is true. And another reason, which is kind of the thesis to this video, whether the magic is hard or soft depends specifically on how it is used in a specific narrative book. More on that later, though. Also, with a character with soft magic, you can still use normal logic to figure something out. If the protagonists know Wizard Bob can help them defeat an obstacle, Wizard Bob is just a tool just as much as like a singing sword or a key. And Wizard Bob has his own advantages and disadvantages. It's the same like how a protagonist could recruit a barbarian to help them with a problem like that, and then like the barbarian also has problems. Maybe Wizard Bob gets cold and the barbarian is secretly scared of frogs or something, or gets too angry and they have to deal with that. And in those ways, you kind of do have some limitings, but it's not specifically in the magic. And I like that distinction, because otherwise you could say a sword is a hard magic system, which it isn't because it's magic. That's the biggest distinction, because magic, I don't think a magic system can ever become fully scientific, like even hard magic, because it's not scientific, it's magic. Even if it's like the fractures of a dead god, I cannot replicate that, or it was not a theory posited in a certain way back period, so it's fantasy. It's never going to happen. Anyway, as opposed to soft magic, a directly hard magic has rules, kind of like the Powder Mages in Brian McClellan's Powder Mage trilogy, or Allomancy in Mistborn, or even like a superhero's power set, like Spider-Man or Superman. In all three examples, Allomancy, Powder Mage, and a superhero, there's a pretty defined usage of the magic system or powers, with the limitations and costs for using the magic and weaknesses. And unlike soft magic, you can read and imagine how the characters would use the powers to get themselves out of a situation, and the costs that they'd have to incur to do such a use, whether it's drinking and burning a medal, or needing red sun or web cartridges or powder or whatever. Now the funny thing is that your magic in your fantasy world doesn't have to be strictly one or the other. It's not exactly a on and off switch. Like, you can have a combination. Sanderson calls it specifically a spectrum. For example, you could have a core hard magic system for your magicians in your world to use, and then you can have some amazing unexplained things in your world. Or you could have a world full of soft magic system, which fills the reader with wonder, but there's a few core rules that all the magicians had to follow. I think, though it's been a while since I read it, that Howl's Moving Castle by Dana Wayne Jones is a example of, in the book, magic is everywhere and it helps with a lot of things. It's just that the soft magic isn't the kind that can turn Sophie Hatter back from an old woman or break Calcifer and Howl's contract without killing them. Those larger plot-hinging problems directly depend on figuring out mysteries in the magic, which are solved through clues and very slight rules on how the magic works. Despite this, I couldn't ever possibly imagine using magic in the world like I can imagine using elements. See, I guess that's another good distinction between hard and soft magic, is if you can imagine how a character would use the magic to solve a problem that doesn't fall into a Deus Ex Machina. That pretty much encompasses what Sanderson talks about in his essay, except for one thing, and it's the thing I think a lot of people get confused with. And the reason they get confused about it is, I think, unfortunately, the terms hard and soft magic that Brandon Sanderson gave to him. They think hard magic means magic that is explained to almost a scientific degree, kind of like that's what hard science fiction is. And that's part of the reason, also because that's what Sanderson does with Cosmere. He gets it down to the physics and stuff. I kind of call this more Sanderson level of attention to detail, personally, grounded fantasy, because people have to focus more on the more reality stuff. It's the same pedantic people who think dragons can't fly because their shape and the relative mass and stuff like that. The people who say they hate hard magic sometimes don't actually not like hard magic, and end up actually just not liking grounded magic. And to some extent, I agree with them. Dragons can fly because they're dragons, and we don't need to, ruin the fun of that. And also in the Cosmere, even though I like it, the grounded magic does get kind of old. However, I do not think that's what hard magic is. Sanderson directly says, note, that by calling something hard magic, I am not implying that it has to follow the laws of science, or even that it has to be explanations of why people can use the magic. All I'm talking about is the reader's understanding of what the magic can do. He goes on to explain how he considers superheroes to each have hard magic systems because they have clearly defined power sets, even though the ways that powers can work can be weird and unrealistic. Being bitten by a radioactive spider, that's not going to give you spider powers. Or if you got blasted by gamma rays, those are almost as nonsensical as magic, though it's kind of in the realm of science. Anyway, I'm also unsure that calling it a soft magic system helps with the view of it. Maybe saying something like a world with soft magic or something would be better, because a system kind of implies rules, and with soft magic there isn't rules, and so people think harder magic is more scientific magic system and softer is less scientific but still a system. I'll still probably call them magic systems because that's what everybody does, but I don't like that terminology. Same with hard and soft, but that's the words have already been used, and redefining terms just for me because I'm being pedantic is not beneficial for anyone. So while Sanderson's essay on the first law of magic ends there, I think their hard and soft magics have one more very interesting quirk, and one that I think is very interesting. Whether a magic system is hard and soft in story doesn't exactly depend on whether there's mechanics behind the magic, like the rules of allomancy or the Cosmere. And I think Mr. Sanderson understood that. I realized this specifically while reading Tress of the Emerald Sea. At the very end of the story, Hoyd, the amazing world hopper, the Cosmere, uses magic that nobody in the book understands to face off with the sorceress. In the story, it has a very well-executed way of using a soft magic system for something beneficial to the protagonist without making a Deus Ex Machina. The heroes know that Hoyd is some kind of magician that could defeat the sorceress, but he is cursed and can't defend himself until he gets into the sorceress's main chamber. So with that limitation, they all work together to to use the hard magic system of the spores in the world to get Hoid to the point where his curse is freed and he can save them all from the sorceress using magic. How? They don't know. And if the reader just picks up that Brandon Sanderson book, they don't know either. It's just magic. However, the interesting thing is that if you read Sanderson's first novel, Elantris, you realize that the magic Hoid uses to stop the sorceress and free Huck from the curse is the magic from Elantris, a magic system that is somewhat hard in the book, though not as hard as Mistborn or Stormlight Archive, but it's still a hard magic system. But in that story, it's treated like a soft, just how like Gandalf is treated. I realized that. After reading a story, you could have the hardest magic system in your world-building document, or pages, or obsidian, or whatever you use, but you could write a story so that it uses it as soft magic. If the reader doesn't know the magic's rules and limitations, even if you know the rules and limitations, the hard magic system that is kind of actually built to be a hard magic system is just as soft as a wizard muttering over a pile of logs and after a moment getting a fire to warm his companions as the evil necromancer sends a blizzard to howl around the cave that they are sheltered in. And with that kind of cool image, I'm going to end the video. Thank you for watching, and if you want me to make more videos about Sanderson's other laws of magic, let me know in the comments. And also please like and subscribe. Thank you, goodbye.